Okay.
That
I
was
have to
weird.
ask, what was
I'm
yeah, what
so
was that?
confused.
Dave, are you with us? Okay, I literally had to sit there and fight with myself, like, okay, I have no clue if they can see me, so I can't, like, look like an idiot going, "What's happening?" So I tried to stay poised, and I hate that you guys missed that, but, we were talking about salad before we came on anyway, so it doesn't matter, right? Strong salad, right, Steve? Am I right?
Strong salad. Very strong salad dressing.
Awesome. Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to NonSequitur. What happened last night, Steve?
In regards to?
The show? I'm trying to remember what we had. It's been such a crazy week.
Oh,
What
that
did we
was
do
well, we
last
had
week?
Issathon and with Eric
Yeah.
Flores, and,
Well,
that went
it
really well because,
it
well,
did.
they're actually
Still
well, people
controversial, though. In a week of controversial shows, I thought that it would be rather pleasant and comforting to everybody to just end on something that everybody can agree on and that we don't have to have any type of contentious arguments over or anything like that. So we decided that we would see if everyone's favorite Jewish carpenter really existed. No controversy there, right, Tim?
None whatsoever. I think everyone will be agreed on this, and the live chat, I'm sure, will be very quiet.
Oh, they already are. I see them all
Oh, this
now.
is a tame
Yes,
episode.
yes,
Yeah, I think
yes,
everybody's gonna
yes.
agree with this. Yeah,
Mm,
we'll be fine.
yeah,
Well, how
calm
have you been,
stuff.
Tim?
Yeah, pretty good, mate. Pretty good. Pretty busy, and I suppose about a day ago I realised that I was coming on today, and I thought, gee, I better get my notes together. So
Oh,
I'm going to be winging it a bit, but we'll see how we go.
that listen, man, that's our philosophy here. There are some days where
Yeah, wing
it's
it.
like 6:30. Like, oh, I have a show tonight, so you're in good company. Um,
Cool.
let's see here what we got. This weekend, big weekend. We've almost got as many shows this weekend in 2 days than we do all week. So tomorrow, of course, we'll be at Homies at 7 with Jimmy and myself. We are going to be talking about exorcism and demon possession. We have a bunch of videos. Have you, Tim or Steve, have you seen the video of this guy from? They say he's from South Africa, but he's not from South Africa because it's
Uh-huh.
some kind of Latin country. But he's he's about like 5 foot tall, and he walks up on like the balls of his feet, and he's got blood coming out of his face. But he's on that drug, that flocka. Have you heard of flocka?
Yeah, right.
Steve,
So is he?
have you heard of flocka?
I no, I mean skinny, but I know what crocodile is, but I don't know what flock is.
You just threw two things at me too quickly. Did you say skinny?
Flaca means skinny in Spanish.
Oh, no, 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 no. I think this is my theory, but I think it's named after the rapper, like Waka Flocka Flav,
Oh,
I think.
okay.
I
Oh,
think.
yeah,
That
no, I'm
could
not
be
familiar
wrong
with it.
too. It could be wrong.
Sure.
But anyway, it causes you in some cases to act like a zombie or,
Yeah,
like that angel dust that makes people or bath salts that make people eat
yeah.
each other's face
Yeah,
off.
I know bath salts.
Um,
Yeah.
so we've got quite a few videos on people on Flocka. You can see how the zombie apocalypse is actually going to take place. Rather fascinating stuff. That will be tomorrow at 7. Then Sunday at 8. Hold on. Sunday at 4.
Well, you know
I'm
that
sorry.
real quick, you know something to be said from that. You know that the zombie apocalypse is actually an active theory that the Walking Dead was caused by Blue Sky from Breaking Bad. That is actually a conspiratorial theory
I've heard
that
that one.
actually, if you look into it,
Yeah.
has some really good
Yeah.
arguments for it. I gotta admit. And I love
I
Breaking
am.
Bad. That was a great series.
That was truly a moment where I literally had nothing to say back to that. That would be the
Right?
greatest thing ever.
Right?
Yes, it could almost top the like the in terms of like movies or TV shows. The number one like most genius and shocking um, tie-in or like surprise, I think, was at the end of Saul when he got up off the middle of the floor and he had been there. Spoiler alert, by the way. If you haven't seen Saul 1 though by now,
Yeah.
you deserve to have it spoiled for you. Um, but yeah, I thought that was great. Okay, so then Sunday, that's Saturday. Let's go to Sunday. Sunday at 4 o'clock. Steve and I will be doing another one of our investigative report videos like we did with Mr. Andrew Rappaport. By the way, uh, DOA, I think nobody's heard from him since that day. I don't know if we had any kind of connection, but
Well, he's blocked everybody. He literally
yeah,
has blocked like everyone, and he just went into
yeah, to be
hiding.
fair too. But this time we're gonna do you know, somebody that would fart in a bathtub and try to eat the bubbles. That would be Dean, I think. That would be Dean. So we're
I think
going
he's done it
to
on more than one occasion.
probably. Dean is a men's right activist, a the editor in chief. That's loosely, but editor in chief of Red Pill Religion, and apparently Steve McRae's worst enemy. Wrote a scathing article about Steve. Said that he was a
Really?
child or a abuse victims abuser. I believe that's the correct word that he used. Abuse victims abuser. You've abused his kids. You have literally abused his kids. You're a hate monger, a yellow belly. You know, everybody knows that you're really not agnostic. You're atheist, which that is true, Dean. You get one. Just a long list of things. So we are going to go through each of his claims and see if we can't suss out what the truth of the matter is. Did Steve really abuse Dean's kids? Is he really a hate monger? Find
Let's
out
find out.
Sunday at 4. That was good. That was good.
Yeah.
And also on Sunday at 8 o'clock, Katie Paulson and myself will be doing the Smoking Nun. This time we're going to be talking about Jilly Juice and the doctor that told people it was okay to drink turpentine. Can't go wrong there. Can't go wrong there. Yeah, that's an appropriate
Yeah.
face, Tim. And then immediately after that, as if that wasn't enough, Red's Rhetoric will be coming out of retirement for a night, and he will be having the flat Earth debate with No Concepts. Do you know the story behind this, Steve? How much No Concepts
I
paid
know
to
there's
have
a
the debate?
long. Yeah, I do know that. Yes, he invested a
Okay,
lot into fundage to make this happen.
it's public, so why don't you tell people how much a lot is?
$500 in a super chat
Yeah,
that he gave to Reds.
yeah, yeah. That's how bad he wants it. $500
That's how
to
bad he
debate
wants,
Red. Can you believe it?
and he's gonna have it.
So
He's gonna have his wish.
yeah, so that will be Sunday at 9. Okay. I thought it would be appropriate and to set the tone tonight. Apparently, Tim, a gentleman sent you an
Mm,
email
yeah.
wanting to challenge a couple of your points, and um, I can't see why, but he was not very enthused about your response. However,
Ah,
I'm going to
okay.
give you the greatest response of the year award because when I read this, I literally was doubling over in laughter. Okay, let me just read
Sure.
the message that was sent to me. Here's the answer from Tim O'Neill to my private email after an unsuccessful attempt to publish on his blog arguments against the authentic. He didn't even spell authenticity right of testimonium Flavianum,
Flavianum.
testimonium.
Yeah, Flavianum. Yeah.
And what was Tim's response? Fuck off, you dumb cunt.
Yeah, and I think that was, you know, a succinct and an actually appropriate response. What he didn't tell you is that this idiot had been harassing me for days, and then was whining about the fact that, you know, he kept posting the same stuff over and over and over again to my blog. I'd already responded to him, and it's stuff that if he actually read any of my blog posts, he would see that he was, you know, telling me, informing me about stuff that I've known about for, you know, I don't know, 30 years. And he kept saying, you know, if you read this, it's like, fuck off, you idiot. And so I just said, look, you know, bye. And so then he found my email address and just started harassing me via email. So yeah, it's not like, so he sent me an argument and that was my response. he harassed me and sent me hate mail, and in the end I said, "Fuck off, you idiot," and put him in spam. So
It's a lost
he is
art.
an idiot, and yeah.
It's a lost art, I think, to sometimes you just have to let people know what you're thinking. A lot of times we try too hard to be. I got yelled at in our comment section the other day for this, that I'm too harsh on people for their initial comments. Like I respond too harshly, when I
Mm.
call them an asshat or something like that. But to me, that's a lost art. It's tact, right? You don't want to be,
Well, life is short. Carl, life
yeah.
is short, and I could have responded to absolutely every single thing this guy said. In fact, I did, but he just didn't want to know. So it was fuck off and goodbye. So and it was why bother? You can't chuck a rock at every dog that barks at you. So why bother?
Girls
You
love
have
the
to pick
cat.
your battles.
Thanks for starting exactly. Thanks for starting on an appropriate tone. I think that's
Yeah,
very well done. Thanks, guys.
I like to set the
there's only
stage.
so much time to go around. And what I think is funny is
That's
why
good.
do the people think they have some kind of instilled privilege or something to like talk to somebody. It's like if you don't want to talk back, you don't want to engage, you're like you have other things to do. They think that they have a right to just throw shit your way and you can't respond. Okay, well, you respond and you move the fuck on if you want to talk to somebody. That's the way it is. We have no obligation to carry on 5 hours of a conversation with somebody that, as you put, we don't think they're going to be responsive to. Forget. Why bother?
Says the
I'd
guy,
rather talk to people
says
that.
the guy who battles literally everyone on Twitter every second of the day.
But I pick my battles, though. That's my point, though. See, but I can't. I have so many battles. I can't fuck with. I can't fucking spend time with the ones that I'm not interested in. I want to pick the battles that I enjoy. Right?
You have to. There's not enough time in the day. Okay, so
Exactly.
now that
I suppose, Carl, what I'd say is I'm interested in talking to the people whose minds aren't already made up, and I appreciate that people do have their minds made up, particularly on this topic. And it was interesting. We were talking before about the poll that you had up on Twitter, where about 33% of people are unsure. And I think my comments, my conversation today is going to be addressed largely at those people. Maybe some of the 44% or so who think that Jesus didn't exist. But I know from 15 years experience of dealing with this topic that there are some people who just will not change their minds on it, and nothing I say is going to change their minds. So that's fine. But I'm interested in that sort of that 33% or so who aren't sure, because I want them to just have a bit of a think about some of the things I'm going to say today. I do have a fair bit to say, so I'm just wondering, should we kick off?
Sure. Yeah. But before you do, let me let everybody know about the polls, so that we can
Sure.
kind of see how if they fluctuate any. Right now on Twitter, to the question, do you believe, divinity aside, do you believe Jesus existed? Yes is 29%, no is 41%, and the undecideds are 30%. And then on YouTube, out of 500 votes, you have the yeses are 21%, no's are 43%, and uncertains are 35%. So if you could get those undecided votes, then that would put the check mark in the yes column.
Now pay attention, people.
Okay,
pay attention.
Let's see what I can do. Look, the first thing I would say is hello to all my haters. I know that they're out in force today, and it was interesting after the last show that in the live chat you had an amazing number of experts in medieval history in the live chat. But when I challenged them afterwards and said, "Okay, you guys had a lot to say in the live chat. Do you want to take me on now?" The sound of crickets was deafening. So it seems that many people are very, very brave when I can't talk back. So all I'd say to anyone you see in the live chat that's fighting a good brave fight when I can't talk back, just ask them if they're going to take me on in the comments afterwards, because I will be there, and I will answer every comment that anyone makes in relation to what I have to say, particularly if you misrepresent what I say. So hello, haters.
Or we'll copy his email response to you.
Yeah. Yeah. Behave, Carl. Look, I think the first thing I do want to say, though, just getting serious, the first thing I do want to say is I quite legitimately understand why people do find mythicism appealing, and why many people find it convincing. Because if you think about it, Christianity makes a series of fundamentally what are a series of historical claims. Unlike many other religions, Christianity is actually founded pretty solidly on claims that it says are true, which are basically claims about history. And those claims are things like, there was this guy Jesus and he said this. There was this guy Jesus and he did that. There was this guy Jesus and he was a number of theological and mystical things. And you can argue against the claims of Christianity by looking at those sorts of claims, those historical claims, and say, well, he didn't say that, or when he said it, he didn't mean this, or he didn't do that, or he couldn't have done that. Rising from the dead, for example, walking on water, or he wasn't those things. You've misunderstood. Or you can cut the ground out from underneath Christianity completely. You can pull the rug out from underneath Christianity completely and go to much less effort by simply countering the original claim, which is there was this guy Jesus. That's effectively what mythicism does. So mythicism is a very effective rhetorical tool if your primary motivation, whether you realize it or not, is you want to debunk Christianity. And this is why I think it is very appealing to a lot of people, because a lot of people are coming at the question from a point of view of, well, is Christianity true? How can I debunk, not is Christianity true? How can I debunk Christianity? And the easiest and most effective way to debunk Christianity is by denying that Jesus existed. Once you do that, all the other claims of Christianity become completely and utterly irrelevant. So I get why people like it. If you want a big stick with which to hit Christianity because you don't like Christianity, mythicism gives you the biggest stick available. And this is why it is very emotionally appealing to many people. I think one of the reasons why it's also convincing to many people is if you, particularly if you're coming from a Christian background, if you kind of work out that this whole God idea is not terribly convincing, and you're starting to tend towards some degree of atheism or at least agnosticism, and then you look at the whole Christian claim. The Christian claim is, well, God does exist because he came to earth in the form of Jesus Christ. And you're starting to think about, well, okay, how did that story arise if there is no God? If you then go looking for an answer to that question, particularly these days when a lot of people go looking by Googling, if you Google, how did Christianity begin? Or the origins of Christianity? Or did Jesus exist? You tend to find two types of information come up. One is Christian apologetic material, particularly fundamentalist Christian apologetic material that says, yes, he did exist, and he was Jesus Christ, the Lord, the Savior, the Son of God, and the second person of the Trinity, and God in human form, who died on the cross and rose again to save us all from sin and hell and all that shit. Or the other type of material you tend to get is mythicist material. So if you go looking for an answer to the question of how did Christianity arise, what's the origins of Christianity? What you tend to find is either Christian apologist stuff or mythicist stuff. What you don't tend to find, or at least what's much harder to find, particularly online, is something in the middle, which is non-Christian scholarly material on the origins of Christianity. And the thing that interests me in this is that I've been studying that stuff in the middle for 35 years. And it's much more interesting. This gets back to my constant theme that the real story is much more interesting than the bad history. It's much more interesting and much more convincing that there was a historical guy and he was nothing like what the Christians claim. But if you go looking for this stuff and you find a whole lot of mythicist stuff and a whole lot of Christian apologist stuff, and you're already pretty much inclined towards some form of atheism or agnosticism, then the mythicist stuff is going to be much more appealing. And quite often what I find is that one of the other reasons people are very emotionally invested in this question is that they associate they're being convinced by mythicism with their deconversion from Christianity. And so I find the people who are most sort of passionate in their defense of mythicism are quite often emotionally invested because for them, mythicism and their deconversion from Christianity go hand in hand. They're the same thing. And so I have actually come across, when I used to spend a lot more time bothering to debate mythicists, I've actually 3 times had people say to me, well, everything you're saying is making sense. And yes, there are major problems with the mythicist position. But if I accept that there was a historical Jesus, that means if the Christians are right about this, maybe they're right about everything else as well. So they are clinging to, in these cases, this is obviously not every mythicist, but in these cases, these people are clinging to mythicism because they see it as a slippery slope argument. If they accept that there was a historical Jesus, then maybe they have to accept all the other stuff, and they're going to end up having to accept Christianity again, and they don't want that. So I can see how people do get very emotionally invested in this topic, and this is why I get hate mail. This is why a lot of people get very upset. And this is why people call me a crypto Christian and a fake atheist and all of that crap and a
We all
liar
know that.
and insane.
We all know
Yeah,
that.
all that stuff.
It,
So, but
which,
keep in mind, I'm not saying that those are the only reasons that people accept mythicism. And there are people who
Sure.
do have a very good grasp of the material and still accept mythicism. There's just not very many of them.
Sure. It's Stephen. Where Steve and I think probably the one thing we actually agree on is this, where we just don't have a dog in the fight. To me,
Yeah.
my personal views on it is whether he did exist or he didn't. Let's say he did. That's great. You still can't go from that to he was the son of God. So I don't think that, by
Doesn't make a
allowing
difference. Yeah.
right, you can't grant that just because he existed, that means that he is the son of God. And then in the flip side, if he didn't exist, well, then obviously, which we are now, but we were right all along in the first place. So it doesn't, it's just one of those things that it's not a hill that I'm going to die on. I like hearing the arguments. That's why we've had Carrier on a few times to talk about this, and while we're going to hear the other side now. But as far as something that it's a hill I'm going to die on, this is not the one. The Sphinx is the hill
And
I'll
I,
die on.
and I agree with Kyle on that. I agree with your analysis, actually, Tim, a lot. And I do think it's a mistake for some people to think that not by giving ground, not by steel manning a person's argument, saying, okay, let's say Jesus existed. Let's go from there and address the arguments, because I agree with you 1,000%. The biggest weapon you can bring to this fight is showing that he never existed. At that point, everything else is irrelevant, right? So, like you said, break that columns, the columns that's holding up Christianity down. That would be fine if they could actually do that. Now, I think that there might be arguments either way, but I think they're investing too much time on that, which is something like Kyle and I think we don't have a dog in that fight. We can see valid arguments on both sides, but I think they're wasting too much time on that than addressing if he existed. Then go ahead and try to demonstrate that the reasoning for Christianity is flawed or something like that. Because I think it's just too much time wasted on this mythicism thing.
I'm fine with him doing it. Like,
Sure.
I don't think it's time wasted. Like, I think the argument's good. It's just not something that
sure. I don't. Yeah, I agree with that. Let me phrase. I don't think it's wasted time. I think that it's worth talking about, but I think people are too much emotionally invested in it one way or another. And like I said, whether it's one or the other, it's fine. But I think there's good arguments both ways.
I think one thing I should point out is that one person who says you shouldn't use mythicism as an argument against Christianity is Richard Carrier, which is one of the few things I kind of agree with Richard Carrier on. But he says it's just too uncertain. Even mythicism is too uncertain, and so there are much better ways to attack. Yeah, it's a bad way to actually attack Christianity, which is interesting coming from the guy who's the biggest booster of mythicism around. But
no, he makes sense on that. That's true.
It's honest.
He does. I agree with him. I agree with him. I think it's a bad argument. It's a bad tactic. I also think it's a bad argument, but he and I disagree on that. There is one thing I do just before we kind of get into the arguments. So there is one thing I do want to address, and it came up in the Twitter, the pre-show Twitter chat that was going on, kind of frenetic one that was going on this morning, where people kept saying that they would disagree with me making an argument from consensus. And I want to make this absolutely clear. I don't know how many times I need to fucking tell people this, but I do not make an argument from consensus. I do not say that because there's a consensus, a major consensus of the overwhelming majority of scholars, Christian and non-Christian, who accept that there most likely was a historical Jesus, therefore there was a historical Jesus. I've not said that. I've never said that, and I will never say that, because that's a fallacious argument. What I do say, though, is there has to be a reason why there is this consensus. It does exist. I've had some people try and tell me it doesn't. It does. You can count the number of actual scholars, qualified people like Carrier, on the fingers of about one hand. There's very, very few actual scholars, and this is out of thousands of scholars. Now, some people try and dismiss that and say, well, most of them are Christians. Fine, forget about the Christians. Let's just look at the non-Christian scholars. There are still thousands of scholars, Jewish, atheist, agnostic, or just plain non-Christians, who all accept that it is most likely there was a historical Jesus. That's a fact. So what I say is, you have to kind of, if you're going to be a skeptic and a rationalist, you have to kind of ask yourself, why does that consensus exist? Is it really that all these people are deluded? Is it really that all these people are brainwashed somehow by Christians on this point, not on anything else? Is it really that Christianity somehow has this massive stranglehold on all forms, all other areas of scholarship, including early Jewish studies? I mean, why would the Jews be interested in accepting that Jesus existed? Because they're not accepting Jesus Christ, they're accepting the historical Jesus, a Jew. So it doesn't make sense that this consensus would exist simply because of some conspiracy or simply because of social pressure. So the question has to be, why does that consensus exist? Why is it that the people who are best qualified to assess this stuff are least likely to be convinced by mythicism, and the people who are least qualified to assess this stuff, which is most mythicists, most of whom aren't scholars, are the ones who are most likely to be convinced? In any other area, any other question, when you get that sort of imbalance with those experts massively on one side and a tiny handful of people who just happen to have a bit of an ideological bias on the other, any rationalist would look at that and say, even though I haven't looked at the arguments yet, there must be a reason why the experts are all on one side. But I want to stress that does not mean the experts are therefore necessarily right. Of course it doesn't. But we have to be rational and look at that consensus and think it must exist for a reason. So I want to make that absolutely clear. Can people please stop saying, I'm saying because there's a consensus, therefore they're right? That doesn't follow. But we need to take account of that consensus without resorting to conspiracy theories and bullshit arguments, which is what I normally see. Does that make sense?
Yep. Absolutely.
I think you have a consensus here.
Yeah, we have a consensus.
Like consensus.
Must be true then.
So let's stop it. So let's sort of look at, let's step back from the question, because a lot of people get very much fixated on the person of Jesus. And what I want to do is step back from the question a little bit and say, okay, let's think about it from the point of view of how did this religion, Christianity, arise? We know when it arose. We know it arose sometime in the early to mid 1st century AD. There are no references to Christians before that. We know roughly where it arose as well. All the evidence indicates the Eastern Mediterranean. So how did it arise? And the first thing we should think about is you can make a strong prima facie case that it arose because there was a historical guy called Jesus. Now, that doesn't mean it's necessarily what happened, but if you look at all of the sources, they all say that there was a historical guy called Jesus. Obviously, the Christian sources all say that. But the very few early non-Christian sources that we have, dating from the very end of the 1st century, mainly from the 2nd, 3rd centuries, and then so on, the Jewish ones, the Roman and Greek ones, they all say that there was a historical person as the center of this, or the beginning of this sect as well. Again, that's a prima facie case, so that doesn't mean that that's what happened. But what it means is that it's pretty easy to sort of say, well, the reason all the sources say this is because that is what happened. This means that anyone who is trying to make a case for another origin has an uphill battle, because what we don't have is any source that says overtly anything else. We don't have a source from any Christian sect that says Jesus only existed in the heavens, never came to earth, and didn't have a historical existence. We don't have that. We have some sources that mythicists try to read that way, And they try to say, well, if you read it with that idea in mind, then you can interpret it that way. And we'll get to at least a couple of those, in a little while. But what we don't have is any source that says that overtly. We also don't have any source that talks about anyone believing that. We don't have any source that talks about say a subsect of Christians or a variant form of Christianity that believed in a purely non-historical, non-earthly, celestial, allegorical, mythic Jesus. So we don't have anyone talking about that at all. We don't have that in any of the pagan sources that we have talking about Christianity. We don't have that in any of the Christian material that is arguing against variant forms of Christianity that existed in the 2nd and 3rd and 4th centuries AD. And that's a telling point because we have a lot of that material. Early Christianity was this wild and woolly thing. There was all various forms of it, and what we have today is descended from the one bit that managed to sort of win the battle for supremacy, and that's what we would call sort of post-Nicene Christianity. And they believed in Jesus as the second person of a Holy Trinity, and they were all God, and Jesus was human in this way and not that way. But there were all these variant forms of early Christianity, and there were lots of books being written both by them and also by the people who were arguing against them. We've mainly got the books written by the people who are arguing against them because they won the argument, so they got to decide whose books got copied. But the interesting thing is what we don't find in any of those arguments is any evidence at all of a variant form of Christianity that believed in a purely celestial, purely allegorical, purely mythic, non-historical, non-earthly Jesus. And that's weird if that's how Christianity arose. So it's very strange that if that's how Christianity arose, nowhere in this plethora of material do we have anyone even mentioning that, particularly given that early form of Christianity, if it had existed, would have had not just a good claim, a legitimate claim to be the original form of Christianity. Yet no one bothered to counter it. No one bothered to write a response to it. We have responses to the tiniest little sects arguing the most trivial variant on the idea of Jesus proceeding from the Father as opposed to being one in being with the Father. Yet we don't have anything at all about this original form of Christianity that supposedly gave rise to it all, that believed in a non-historical Jesus. All of the Jesuses, all of the forms of Jesus that we find in every piece of evidence that we have from this earliest period of Christianity, all believed in a Jesus who was on earth. Now that goes from one extreme to another. From one extreme, we have the people like the Ebionites who believed that Jesus was completely human, didn't seem to believe that he was God at all, seemed to believe that he was the Jewish Messiah, definitely believed that, but they believed in a purely human Jesus, obviously purely human, historical, and on earth. At the other end of the extreme, we have the docetic forms of Gnosticism, who believed that Jesus wasn't human at all. He was purely spiritual. He only appeared to be human. Docetism comes from a Greek word meaning to appear. He appeared to be human, but he was actually a completely spiritual being who only had the illusion of suffering, of eating, of living like a human being. But they still believed that this docetic, this appearance of Jesus was appeared in historical time on earth. So again, whether you're talking about one extreme or the other, they're still talking about a historical Jesus on earth. All forms of mythicism, and there are many forms, but all forms of mythicism require that there must have been an early form of Christianity that believed in a non-historical Jesus, that it then gave rise to stories about Jesus on earth. It was then forgotten, somehow suppressed. All of the evidence about it was wiped out. And the only bits that are left are the bits of the Christianity that believed in or came to believe in a historical Jesus. The problem with that is that means the whole of mythicism is based on a supposition. The whole of mythicism is based on the idea that this form of Christianity, this original form, that believed in a non-historical Jesus, did exist, but there's no clear, overt evidence for it. And the problem with an idea based on a supposition is Occam's razor. Occam's razor comes along and says, well, here we have an idea about Christianity's origins based on a human guy. All of the evidence talks about a human guy. Here we got another idea based on this idea of a supposed mythic Jesus form of Christianity. There's no evidence for that. So which one do we believe? And this is why, fundamentally, why most scholars accept that there was a historical guy. Now, the mythicists sort of say, well, there was evidence of this early form of Christianity, the belief in a purely mythic Jesus. And as I said, what they're doing is they're taking evidence, taking texts, they're interpreting it with that idea in mind, so with that supposition as their assumption, and saying, if you read it this way, the letters of Paul are talking about a purely celestial Jesus. If you read it this way, then these other texts are talking about a purely celestial Jesus. And there are problems with that interpretation, but the point is, nowhere do we have a text that says, this is how it happened, guys. He was in the heavens, he never came to earth, or he was in the heavens, he got crucified in the heavens, and he went back up to the upper heavens, which is sort of the carrier form of Christianity. It's just that there is no such text. And mythicists have to resort to conspiracy theories to explain why this evidence isn't there. And the problem is, given what I just said, it should be there because we have this massive corpus of apologetic literature that deals with all these variant forms of Christianity, doesn't mention this one at all. The most logical, rational reason that there is no evidence for this form of Christianity is that it didn't fucking exist. All mythicism requires this supposition of a form of Christianity for which there is no evidence.
Yeah, I definitely think you have a good case on that. My question would be, when at certain time did we in previous things say, okay, at this point, the Greek gods, we are going to submit that they were mythological? But even back in the days when the first atheist type of Christians were around that didn't believe the Roman pantheon gods, they were labeled atheists, but they were, some of them might have been saying that these gods are mythological. They do not exist to some degree. So in the historical record in the Greek and Roman, when do we actually see that? And you're arguing that because we do see that in those cases, but we don't see it ever in the Christian case. Is that kind of your argument?
Yeah, kind of. I mean, yeah, there were some people, not very many, but there were some people in ancient Greek and Roman culture who did not believe that the pantheon of Greek Roman gods, that the Olympian gods actually existed, and they just believed that the stories were stories. Most of those guys weren't actually atheists, though. They did believe that there was still some kind of a cosmic divine, but they believed that the stories about the Olympian gods were kind of silly stories. But so yeah, there certainly were people who believed that, who accepted that those things were entirely legendary. But you're right. It's interesting that at no point did anyone sort of say, well, this guy Jesus didn't exist. We don't actually find any of the pagan opponents of Christianity saying, well, what about these guys over here, these fellow Christians of yours, or these Christians who used to exist that we've heard about, who never said Jesus, he said Jesus never came to earth in the first place. So that's another place we would expect to find, perhaps, to find some reference to this proto-Christian mythic form of Christianity, if it had existed. But we don't find that either. And we do have a reasonable amount of material on the arguments that pagans and Jews were using against Christianity, because we have the Christian responses to their arguments. No pagan or Christian critic, as far as we can see, made that comment. So that one's less certain. But the apologetic literature against so-called heresies, that's where we would expect to find this mythic Jesus to at least be hinted at. There's not even a whisper about it. And this is a bit of a sucking black hole at the heart of mythicism, because, as I said, all forms of mythicism require that there must have been this early form of Christianity, and the evidence for it is simply not there. This is why mythicism has to, as I said, go and find evidence for that in texts that everyone else reads as being about a historical Jesus. And so I just wanted to maybe sort of turn to a couple of those. Just before that, though, there was something else that came up in the Twitter exchange this morning, and it's an argument that I see quite regularly. So I might just quickly address that and then sort of move on to some of the arguments that mythicists such as Carrier say are evidence of this mythic proto-Christianity that they need to have in order for their theory to survive. The other argument I want to address, though, is the argument from silence. So there are people who say we have no contemporary references to Jesus, therefore Jesus didn't exist. Right? We should have contemporary references to Jesus, but if you look at all the ancient material that we have dating from his time, there's no references to this guy. Have you guys heard that argument?
Oh yeah, of course. But
and there's a couple of prominent proponents of it, one of whom actually popped up in the Twitter feed this morning, a guy called Polkovich. So the argument sort of goes like this: we've got all this material from the ancient world. If there was this guy, he should have been mentioned in some of this material. As an argument against the Jesus of Christianity, so the one who walks on water, rises from the dead, does some other stuff that's pretty remarkable. And it's not a bad argument. You'd kind of expect, if there was someone who was doing that kind of stuff, raising other people from the dead, for example, feeding 5,000 people with a picnic basket.
It would get around, right?
You think it would? Yeah, exactly. So it's not a bad argument against the Jesus of Christianity, but it fails pretty badly as an argument against a historical Jesus period. Because if this guy existed and we're all sort of non-believers, so we don't think that he was God, then he was a Jewish preacher. And why would any Roman historian who had very little interest in Jewish affairs at all mention that there was a peasant preaching something to other peasants in the arse end of Galilee? Why would they even be aware that that was happening? But why, if they were aware, I don't know why they would be, but if they were aware of it, why would they bother mentioning it? In what context? So when you look at this argument and you look at some of the material that these people say supposedly should have mentioned Jesus, the argument really starts to fall apart, because the way you make an argument from silence is you don't just note that the sources are silent on a particular point. You have to show that they shouldn't be. So if you look at some of the sources that supposedly should have mentioned Jesus, there's a couple that I find particularly amusing. A guy called Silius Italicus, he wrote a poem about the Punic Wars. So this is the wars between Rome and Hannibal. The problem with that is the Punic Wars happened in the BCs. So I can't sort of see how a poem about something that happened in the BCs would mention Jesus, particularly when it's about a war at the other end of the Mediterranean that had nothing to do with Jews, let alone Jews in the 1st century AD. Doesn't make a lot of sense. There's another one, a guy called Valerius Flaccus, who wrote a poem about Jason and the Argonauts, which is a legend set in archaic ancient Greece. Again, why would he mention Jesus? I can't see how Jesus would be relevant to that poem. But the one I really love is a guy called Decimus Asiaticus, whose only surviving writing is a letter complaining about a stolen pig. Now, help me out. Can you guys think of any reason why someone writing a letter about a stolen pig would mention Jesus? I can't see
if
any
praise
reason.
Jesus to get it back, because maybe he's like, Jesus, please get back my pig.
If my bacon was gone, that would be the first thing I would say. Jesus Christ, where is the bacon? That makes total sense.
It's
yeah, but unless you're Jewish, then you can't eat it, right? But when it's like, I agree
right.
that
Jesus would.
Oy vey.
Oy vey. I totally agree that you only expect there to be a writing of him in a situation where you would expect there be a writing to him. But I think there might be something to be said is we have things like coinage that we have had people faces put on coins, people we know existed, Caesar, and that all those people. Why is it that as such a figurehead person that Christ would have been back then, a person of leadership, why was he not immortalized in some way? No statues, no coinage, nothing along those lines to add to the authenticity that existed. Excuse me.
Sure. So again, getting back to my point, good point, Steve. Let me address that. Again, getting back to my point about the way you make an argument from silence. One of the things you need to look at is what kind of evidence would we expect to have for someone like Jesus? So would we expect, for example, for there to be coins minted with the head of Jesus on it? Would we expect there to be statues and so on? The way we measure that is we look at other analogous figures like Jesus. So we look at, for example, other early early first century or late first century BC, early first century AD Jewish preachers, prophets, and messianic claimants. And there's about half a dozen or so, maybe a few more, of figures like this. So we've got people like Theudas, we've got people like the Samaritan prophet, the Egyptian prophet, Throngers, Hillel, Anias. And when we look at what evidence we have for them, we don't have any coins for them. We don't have any statues for them. We don't have any contemporary references to any of them. And this is the key point. The way you measure whether or not we should expect to have contemporary references to someone like Jesus is by looking at the other people who were like Jesus. Do we have contemporary references to any of them? No. Like Jesus, we only have references to them that were written decades or even centuries later. That's how you determine how much evidence we would expect to have. And when you say, he was a prominent guy, it should have been commemorated in some way. Was he a prominent guy? I think that's an argument against him being prominent, but it's not necessarily an argument against him not existing. If we actually compare the evidence for a couple of those other guys I just mentioned, let's take Theudas, for example, or the Egyptian prophet. These guys who are mentioned once, maybe twice, in Josephus. So it's about towards the end of the first century AD. They both existed around about Jesus' time, the beginning of the first century AD. These guys apparently had followings in the thousands of people, and the Romans had to mobilize squadrons of troops to disperse their followers. So these guys were reasonably significant enough for the Roman prefect to have to mobilize cohorts of cavalry and infantry to disperse their followers. Yet, do we have any contemporary references to them? No. Do we have any statues or coins? No. We probably wouldn't expect these sort of people to have statues made of them. Certainly not coins. They weren't rulers. So, do we expect that for Jesus? No. This is the test that we use. The other thing that's interesting, though, is even if you look at what the Gospels say about Jesus, and these are the Gospels, by the way, that are trying to boost how significant and important he was. When we look at what they say about Jesus, they're actually not making terribly big claims. The Gospel of Mark, for example, says he became really famous. He was doing these miracles. He became really famous. He was famous throughout the whole of Galilee. You can walk across Galilee in a day, in an afternoon at a brisk pace. So he became really famous across the whole of Galilee. It's a bit like saying he became famous across the whole of the next 6 city blocks. So they're not actually making a big claim for him to be famous at all. Gospel of Matthew takes that bit and he's using Mark as his source. So the writer of the Gospel of Matthew tries to pump it up a bit and says, oh, well, he was also famous in Judea and the Transjordan and the 10 cities of the Decapolis and throughout the whole of Syria. So he's trying to pump it up. But even in the Gospels, they don't depict him as actually being terribly famous outside his backyard. And Galilee was a backwater, even by Jewish standards. And Judea generally was a backwater by Greek and Roman standards. So even the Gospels don't make him out to be terribly famous. And remember, I just mentioned about Theudas and the Egyptian prophet needing to have their followers dispersed by large bodies of Roman troops. Even the Gospels make it clear that in their version of the story that Jesus was arrested by a handful of temple guards. There was a bit of a scuffle and not much happened. Even the Gospels aren't making him out to be terribly famous. So do we have evidence that this guy was famous even in the Christian material? The answer is no. Make sense?
Yeah, it actually does. Like I said, I think it can go either way on that, whether they're going to commemorate him or not. But I think that you have a valid explanation as to why we wouldn't necessarily see this type of commemoration.
A lot of people, I think a lot of people overestimate the amount of source material that we have from the ancient world. So I do see people saying things like, well, the Romans were great administrators and they recorded a whole lot of material and they were very good at recording court cases and so on, and we don't have any references to the arrest and execution of Jesus in that material. And we don't, because it doesn't exist. I mean, yes, the Romans did record a lot of stuff, and they did have a lot of administrative material and so on. We have almost none of it. Almost none survives. We have none of it at all from Judea in this period. We've got a few fragments from Egypt and a few other bits and pieces that survive in other places. So people who seem to think that we've got some vast archive of the court cases of Pontius Pilate from 30 to 33 AD or something, it doesn't exist. We don't have that stuff. We've got very, very little at all about anything to do with Jewish affairs. If we didn't have the Antiquities of the Jews by Josephus, we would know virtually nothing about Jewish history in the 1st century AD. Almost nothing, because the Romans just weren't interested. Every now and then we get a reference in a Roman historian saying, oh, the fucking Jews have rebelled again. And there's a brief reference to the Jewish War, which was quite a major rebellion. Went for sort of 3 years and was reasonably successful initially. References to it in Roman historians are quite scanty. Again, if we didn't have Josephus's whole book on the Jewish War, we would know virtually nothing about it. So people have got a very strange idea about how much material we do have in which you would expect this reference to this Jewish preacher to exist, and we just don't have much at all. So it actually isn't a good argument. Yet it's one that I see all the time. Again, interestingly, our good friend Richard Carrier never uses it, and that's because there's a lot of things he can say about Carrier, but he's not an idiot, and he knows that this is a crap argument for exactly the reasons I've just explained. So that's the argument from silence. It doesn't. It's one that seems to convince a lot of people, and it's actually pretty poor. But I want to get back to the ways in which, speaking of Carrier, the ways in which people like him try to get around that sucking black hole at the heart of mythicism, which is the lack of evidence for the proto-Christian mythic Jesus Christianity that they need to have as the origin point of the stories about Jesus. And one of the ways that Carrier does it is he refers to a text called the Ascension of Isaiah. Don't know if you guys are familiar with this one. Have you come across it?
Doesn't sound familiar to me.
Okay. It's a fairly obscure text, and it's we've got it in fairly fragmentary form. We've got it in an Ethiopian translation. We've got it in a Slavonic, so a very, very early form of the Slavic languages, and we've got it in a Latin translation. And so it's quite hard for us to piece together exactly what it would have said originally, because it originally would have been written in Greek. But we can work out that it was probably written maybe in the late 1st century, possibly the early 2nd century, which actually makes it pretty early. That puts it around about the same time the Gospels were being written. So it's an interesting text from that point of view. It's a Christian text, and it describes a vision supposedly seen by the prophet Isaiah. Now, it was written in the 2nd century AD, so it wasn't recording anything seen by Isaiah, but that gives it sort of credibility because Isaiah was a famous prophet. But in this text, Isaiah sees a vision, and he sees Jesus descending from the upper heavens, from the 7th heaven, down through the various heavens, and sees him crucified, and then sees him ascend when he rises from the dead back up through the heavens. And the whole point of this text is that no one knows that it's Jesus because he takes on a different form as he moves through these different heavens. And then it's not until he rises from the dead and he ascends back up through the heavens that he reveals himself to be the Messiah and in some sense divine. And so the whole point of the text is, they thought they killed him, but he fooled them. And as he ascends back up through the 7 heavens to take his place at the throne of God again, he demonstrates who he really was. Now, what Carrier argues is that this is the smoking gun. So he argues that this is that text I just said didn't exist, which is supposedly a text that has Jesus coming from the upper heavens, descending not to earth, but to the lower heavens, so to what's called the firmament. And he gets crucified there, not on earth, and then he rises from the dead there, and then he ascends back into the heaven. He gets crucified there by demons, not on earth by human beings. Now, if Carrier is right, then there's your evidence. There's the evidence that there actually was a belief in a Jesus who was purely celestial and not historical, purely heavenly and died in the heavens, not earthly and died on earth. But there's a problem. And the problem is that actually, if you're familiar with the text, this is why people like me, when you read Carrier's book, you think, what the fuck are you talking about? If you actually read Carrier's text, Carrier's book, he says, well, he descended just to the firmament, but nowhere else. And he gets crucified on a tree that's like it's not a real tree, it's kind of a celestial version of a tree. And he's never depicted as going to earth. The only problem is that if you actually turn to the Ascension of Isaiah, you read this. And I saw one like the Son of Man, that's Jesus, the Messiah, dwelling with men and in the world, and they did not recognize him. It also says that an angel talks to Isaiah saying, Jesus talks about Jesus taking on in your form. He's on your form, in your form, human form. So the text actually does have Jesus coming to earth. It actually does have Jesus dwelling among men. So how does Carrier deal with this? And he kind of, sort of does. He says on page 43 of his book, this one, on the historicity of Jesus. He says
Shameless
on page
plug.
43, yeah, shameless plug, available in all good bookstores. He says that this does describe some kind of earthly sojourn, but in an absurdly brief fashion. Well, it doesn't matter if it's absurdly brief. The point of the text is that he descends, he dies, and then he ascends. It says he dwelt on earth. He didn't visit. It's not a sojourn. It says he lived there. Now, it says that they didn't recognize him, but that's the whole point of the text. The angels, demons, as he descended through the other heavens, didn't recognize him either. But he does come to earth. So there goes the smoking gun. It actually requires, there's no way you can argue your way around this. Carrier is just wrong. And the interesting thing about this is that people who read Carrier's book, who don't then go and check the text in question and don't have the background, because that is a very complicated, particularly complicated text, don't have the background to be able to do that, are going to read Carrier saying, oh, well, here's a text that says that he didn't come to earth and that he died in the heavens and ascended back into the upper heavens. And they're going to think that he's making a good argument. Whereas those of us who actually know the material, we read Carrier's book and page after page after page, you come across arguments like this and you just think, he's wrong. But most people don't have the background to be able to tell that he's wrong. And I think that's actually an interesting point. I often ask people who are mythicists, how much reading have you done on this stuff that isn't written by mythicists? And the answer quite often, usually, is none. They're getting all of their information about this stuff from mythicists, which is a bit like talking to a creationist who thinks they know enough about evolution to be able to refute evolution, and they're getting all their information from creationists.
Do you think that's just an
have a good
oversight?
understanding.
But do you think that's an oversight, or do you think that's a cognitive bias? Because, like you said, Richard is not a dumb guy. I think he's very intelligent. Do you think it's just an oversight on his part, or is this just his cognitive bias is invested in this? Yeah.
No, I think it's a cognitive bias. I think he has. I mean, I don't want to psychoanalyze someone via the internet, but I think he is very keen on this idea of that Jesus potentially didn't exist. He doesn't say he definitely didn't. He says it's most likely that he didn't, and so he has to therefore find ways to support that. And one of the ways he's supporting that is by saying, well, here's the text that can be read to be talking about Jesus descending just to the lower firmament, not to earth. But I think because of that cognitive bias, he's dismissing the fact that the text clearly says that he came to earth. Nowhere in the text, by the way, does it say where he got crucified. It just says he got crucified and then rose from the dead. But the fact that the text actually has him dwelling among men, come on, that's very, very difficult to just dismiss. And he just kind of brushes it aside. He makes a fairly weak argument that it's some kind of rewriting of a Old Testament reference in Baruch to God manifesting himself on earth. It's a bit confused. But anyone I know who knows this text, who has read Carrier's book, have just said, that's just bullshit. And this is the problem. Most people who read Carrier's book don't know the stuff well enough to be able to see when he's pulling a swift one. And there's a lot of smoke and mirrors in Carrier's book. And he's very good at arguing very forcefully. You have to kind of be able to see what he's doing in order to pick up the fancy footwork. It's usually hidden in some of his footnotes, or you have to actually go and read the text yourself to see where he's misrepresenting it. And I think that's one example. There's another one that I want to use. I mean, as we've talked before, it would take me weeks, months, probably years to go through every single mythicist argument and explain why it's wrong. So I can't do that. I'm not going to do that today. But what I want to do is I want to demonstrate. It's way too long. But I want to pick just a couple. And this is another one that I want to talk about that shows that, first of all, mythicists have to go to great lengths to try and interpret the texts so that their ideas still make sense. And people also have to have a very good knowledge of what they're doing in order to see where the smoke and mirrors are actually coming into play. So keep in mind what I was saying before about mythicism argues that there was this early form of Christianity that believed in a completely non-historical Jesus, and that believed in a purely celestial Jesus. And because we don't have any texts that actually say that, they have to try and read some of the early material with that as their assumption. And one of the pieces of the early material that they read are the letters of Paul. So they argue that Paul didn't believe in a historical Jesus. They argue that Paul believed in a purely celestial Jesus. Now, the problem with that is that there are several references in Paul's stuff about where he talks about Jesus in such a way that it seems pretty clear to basically everyone, except mythicists, that he's talking about a historical guy. There are about a dozen of those. I want to take just one, and you have to bear with me, guys. I'm going to go through Carrier's argument in some detail. First of all, because I need to show exactly how convoluted it is. Secondly, because I know from dealing with Carrier and his fan base that if you don't go through it in detail, they say that you haven't actually dealt with it at all. So what I'm going to be referring to here is a reference in Paul's letter to the Romans. Now, before anyone's brains explode and says he's talking about the New Testament, yes, I'm talking about a text that found its way into the New Testament. But when Paul dictated this letter to a scribe, because we know that's how he did it, he wasn't thinking that it was going to end up in the Bible. In fact, he probably would have found that fairly weird. This is just a letter. So he was writing a letter probably from somewhere in Greece, probably somewhere in around about the 50s AD, and he was writing to the Jesus sect community. We call them Christians now. They wouldn't have called themselves that at that stage, maybe. But the Jesus sect community in Rome, we know there was quite a large Jewish community, probably in the tens of thousands in Rome. So at least some of them, it appears, were actually followers of Jesus and believed that Jesus was the Messiah. So Paul's writing to them saying, I'm going to come and visit you soon. And so he's addressing this community. And he greets them in the name of Jesus. And he says, he refers to Jesus as God's son, who was descended from David according to the flesh. Now, David here is King David, the ancient king of the Jews. Paul, clearly, like all Jews in the first century, believed that David was a human being who had existed in historical time. Whether he was or not is another question, but Paul believed that, and this is Paul who's saying this. So Paul is saying that Jesus was descended from King David. You can't be descended from a human historical king if you aren't a human and historical. That just doesn't make sense. So if Paul is saying a descendant of King David according to the flesh, because Paul believed that, like many Jews, believed that the Messiah had a heavenly pre-existence, he's saying in his human aspect, according to the flesh, he was a descendant of this human king. So you have a major problem if you're a mythicist. Romans 1:3 is a bit of a problem. So what does Carrier do with this? Well, what he does is he basically translates this in a different way. So on page 553 of his book on the historicity of Jesus, he translates this as not as who was descended from King David according to the flesh. He translated as who was made from the sperm of David, manufactured from the sperm of David. So how does he get that translation? Well, the first thing he does is he notes the key verb here, which is genomenu in Greek, which is the aorist masculine genitive of the form ginomai. Ginomai is a fairly broad verb, but it means to come into being, to become, to go from one state to another state, to come to pass. So a lot of those passages in old translations of the Bible, and so it came to pass that this happened. These are usually translations of the verb ginomai. So what Carrier says is, well, that's what ginomai means. It means to come into being, to come about. But he finds one use of a form of the verb ginomai in Paul, where he is talking about in 1 Corinthians 15:45, he's talking about Adam, and he says that Adam became the first man. So Carrier argues, well, Adam wasn't born. Adam was made. Adam was manufactured. God in Genesis, this is what Paul would have believed, God in Genesis is described as forming him out of clay or out of dust and then breathing life into him. So what Carrier argues is if Paul can use a form of the verb, ginomai, to mean to refer to someone who was manufactured, maybe that's what he's doing in Romans 1:3. So maybe ginomai doesn't mean he became, according to the flesh, he came into being as a descendant of King David. What he's saying is that he was manufactured the way that Adam was. Then he looks at the next word, key word in the phrase, which is the noun spermatos, which comes from the word sperma, meaning seed. Now, literally, it means seed, as in the thing you plant in the ground and a plant or tree will grow. But also, it is used in semi-figuratively to refer to semen. It can be used to refer to semen. So, Carrier says, if ginomai can mean manufactured, and if spermatos can mean not just seed, but semen, maybe Paul is saying that Jesus was manufactured by God out of semen of King David. So how do we get semen from King David in the heavens? Because remember, Jesus doesn't, according to Carrier, doesn't come to earth. So how do we get semen from heaven from King David in heaven? Well, then he turns to 2 Samuel 7:12-14. Let me read that passage for you. This is a prophet talking to King David. The prophet says, "When your days are fulfilled and you lie down with your ancestors, I will raise up your offspring after you, who will come forth from your body, and I will establish his kingdom. And he will build a house for my name, and I'll establish the throne of his kingdom forever." But when he's talking about this in the Greek translation of that Old Testament passage, called the Septuagint, what he actually says is, "I will raise up your seed after you." And then we've got our word sperma again. So Carrier says this: maybe this passage was being read as what we call a pesha, which is a passage that has one meaning in its context, but can be taken as having another more mystical meaning out of that context. This is something that Jews did all the time in this period. So maybe when he's talking about taking seed from your belly and raising up a son after you, he's not just talking about King Solomon, which is what it means in context, because he talks about building a temple, the house of God. He's actually saying, it can be interpreted as saying, that he's actually taken physical semen into the heavens, and he's going to use that to create the Messiah. So Romans 1:3 is actually saying that Paul believed that there was a cosmic sperm bank in the sky. Let me just read what Carrier actually says. It would not be unimaginable to Paul that God could maintain a cosmic sperm bank. This is on page 576 of Carrier's book. A page later, he goes from "it might be that this is the case" to "it was the case." The notion of a cosmic sperm bank is so easily read out of this scripture, he says, that it's all but required by the outcome of subsequent history, and it's not an improbable assumption. That's on page 77. So we go from text that everyone else translates as he was a descendant of King David, historical king, to Paul saying he was created out of a cosmic sperm bank in the sky by God, and so he never came to earth, and Paul's not talking about an earthly historical Jesus at all, just one created out of someone's semen.
That's
Can I just
pretty
stop
strange,
there?
actually.
Does that strike you as a very plausible argument, or does that strike you as contrived bullshit?
After what we've seen on this show, yes.
Yeah,
It's
exactly. It's totally plausible. No, I don't find that narrative to be convincing at all.
Okay.
Even plausible.
And that's even before I go through all the problems with it, of which there are many. So let's look, in the interest of being fair to Carrie. I mean, there are major problems with what he argues. Let's start, for example, with him saying that the way that Paul uses ginomai in that other passage about Adam means that ginomai can be translated as meaning manufactured rather than just coming into being. If we actually turn to the passage in Genesis where Adam is created and we look at it in the Septuagint, so this is the Greek translations where we see the Greek translation that was around in Paul's time, where we see the way the words is actually used at the time in Greek. What we don't find is a reference to Adam being manufactured, being shaped, using the verb ginomai. We do find the use of the verb ginomai, but we don't find it in relation to him being manufactured. The shaping part is, the word there is eplapsin, which means a form of the verb plasso, which means to form. So when he's talking about Adam being manufactured, when the book of Genesis is doing that, the Greek verb used is not ginomai. It then goes on to say, then he breathed into the face of this figure that he made out of clay, and he became a living man. So the becoming part, ginomai, is not the shaping, it's the bit that happens after he breathes life into him. He goes from one state of being to another, which is what ginomai means. So ginomai does not mean manufactured. It means coming into being, which is the standard way in which that verb is translated when people are translating Romans 1:3. The problem with his translation of spermatos as meaning actual semen, well, there's a couple of problems with that. First of all, we have other uses of that word by Paul, and he's not talking about semen. So Paul says in Galatians 3:16, he says, now to Abraham and his seed, sperma, were promises made. He said, not and to seeds as of many, but as of one, and to your seed, sperma, which is Christ. He's not talking about semen. He's talking about descendants. Right? In every single use of the word in Paul, he's talking about descendants. The word can mean semen, but if again we go back to the Septuagint and we look at how it is used, 75% of its usages are in relation to descendants, lines of descent, lineage, 75%. Most of the others are references to seed as in seed of plants. Some of the others are references to semen, particularly in all those passages in Leviticus about nocturnal emissions and masturbation. So it can mean semen. But most of the time, in this sort of context, when it's saying the seed of such and such, in fact, pretty much all of the time when it's saying the seed of such and such, it's talking about descendants. So Carrier's translation is strained at best. And I think most people, when they look at it objectively, can see that it's contrived. But he has to do it. He has to do it because otherwise, here we have a reference in Paul to Paul talking about Jesus as a human descendant of a human being, kata saka, according to the flesh. And if he does that, the whole idea that Paul didn't believe in a historical Jesus collapses, and therefore a major plank of the entire mythicist argument falls apart. Because without Paul believing in this celestial Jesus, and without, say, something like the ascension of Isaiah, they've got fucking nothing. Can you see why I don't find this stuff convincing?
Well, there's certainly a reaction going on in the live chat.
I'll bet.
I think there's a
I think you have a lot of fans out there. I mean, everybody in the live chat just loves you at the moment. They're just saying how much you're right on everything and so expert.
Yeah.
And okay, I can't even pretend to any longer. It's hit or miss on the live chat right now.
Fine. Look, and the thing is, as I said before, people are emotionally invested in this stuff, and I actually don't care whether Jesus exists or not. But I do care about atheists making smart arguments that actually work, and that stuff just doesn't work. That Romans 1:3 thing is one of the silliest pieces of argument I've ever seen in a supposedly scholarly peer-reviewed book. I mean, it was laugh out loud stupid. And people who know this material, often say to me, what about the Romans 1:3 argument? It's like if you want to show someone exactly how bad this stuff is, you bring out the cosmic sperm bank in the sky. It's ridiculously bad. But of course, people who are emotionally invested in it like it.
I want to address one thing too, because I'm seeing this a lot, that they feel that you're bashing Carrier, and Steve, do you think that I don't see him bashing Carrier. I see him
not at all. Matter of fact, I have not seen him do a personal attack to Carrier yet. I mean, maybe questioning his methodological approach, his conclusions, and he actually said he thinks Richard is an intelligent guy. He's not like he's bashing on a person.
Guy. He's a smart guy. He knows the material well. He's got great linguistic facility, but unfortunately, it's what you do with it. And my problem with him is that he is very creative in how he props up this argument. And if you really want him to be right, then you can kind of just sort of read it and think, yeah, that sounds plausible, until you actually dig down into it. And this is the other thing. Most people would not have the linguistic and academic background that I've developed, and that many other people do have, to be able to dig into that argument and see why it doesn't work. So most people would just read it and just think, oh, that makes sense.
Other than some of the theists that, like Bart Ehrman and other people that have criticized Carrier, do you know of any other atheists that share your opinion of a caliber of a historian or along those lines, or how many of them actually are agreeing with you as far as your counter arguments to Carrier? Besides, obviously, some theists out there that I'm sure agreeing, and I know for a fact are.
Yeah. The first thing I think we need to make clear, and I want to say this in a way that people don't see it as a personal attack, Carrier is, let's just say, he's not a major figure in the field, right? So the idea that there are lots and lots of scholars out there who are paying lots of attention to his arguments, that's fantasy. He has a handful of peer-reviewed material, and he'll never held an academic position since he graduated. He is effectively a blogger. So it's not like there are conferences where people are sitting around debating Richard Carrier's stuff. But there are some people who have paid attention to it in the way in which experts do pay attention to occasionally to fringe theories in their fields. And so people like R. Joseph Hoffman have countered it. The late Morris Casey wrote a rather grumpy book on mythicism, where he basically said it was a load of bullshit. So they're aware of it. They just don't consider it to be important enough to actually counter it. This is another reason why I do what I do, because unfortunately that means that the only people who are countering it are mainly Christian apologists, and so of course they're fairly easy to dismiss. This is why so many people say that I'm a Christian apologist, because that's a nice way that they can dismiss me without having to actually engage with what I'm saying, even though that's totally.
Yeah, I honestly find that to be disingenuous, and I get that the same thing. I pointed out to several atheists bad arguments that you just should not be using, and they'll think that you're a theist apologist for doing that. It's like, no, if you stop using the bad arguments, means you're more likely to promote some of the good arguments if you want to go learn of them. Promoting a bad argument doesn't make you a better atheist.
Yeah, absolutely.
It makes you a bad person, throwing a bad argument around. So I get that. I
Yeah.
understand.
So look, again, I would say I've said it to you guys in the lead up to this show. If someone showed me a good mythicist argument that made it clear to me that a Jesus, a historical Jesus, most likely didn't exist, I would happily accept it because I don't care if the guy existed or not. And as Kyle was saying earlier on, we don't. It doesn't make any difference if he was a historical Jesus who wasn't what Christianity claims, or he was a non-historical Jesus who also wasn't what Christianity claims. The result is exactly the same. But the reason I am interested in this stuff is, first of all, I'm quite interested in the origins of Christianity. But secondly, I am interested in bad arguments. It's one of my hobbies. I collect bad historical arguments. And this is a bad historical argument. It's not the worst I've ever come across. And some people sort of say, oh, it's a crackpot argument. No, forms of it are. But Carrier's thesis isn't a crackpot argument. It's just not very good. And a lot of it is sort of propped up with that kind of that cosmic sperm bank type of reasoning, which is, you really have to want to believe it in order to find that stuff convincing. But I think, as I said before, one of the reasons why people do get emotionally invested in mythicism is because they don't have any alternatives. Because the only alternative to mythicism for many people that is readily accessible is Christian apologist stuff that says not just that he existed, but also that he walked on water, rose from the dead, and was the second person of the Trinity in God in human form. So what I'd like to do is, as quickly as I can, kind of elaborate on what it is that non-Christian scholars, including all those Jewish scholars and people like Bart Ehrman and people like Paul Fredrickson and people like, there's a pile of them, Gerd Ludemann, who believe that there was a historical Jesus. They just don't believe that he was the Jesus of Christianity. He was a Jewish preacher. And I want to sort of explain the context that helps us to understand why they believe that. So if you bear with me, I just want to maybe sort of paint a bit of a historical picture. If you imagine for a moment, if you imagine that you were a first century Jewish peasant living in Galilee, your life would be pretty hard. We know from the archaeology that that your life would consist of subsistence level farming, and you would be having a lot of trouble, probably at any given time, even in a good year, scraping together a living for you and your family. One of the reasons why life would be so hard is that you had to give about 1/3 of your production in taxes. Now, I pay about 1/3 or more, actually, of my income in taxes. But that's because I live in Australia, and so I get things like modern state, so I get things like roads and schools and hospitals, and because I don't live in the United States, I get universal healthcare. So I get a lot of stuff back from my taxes. A Jewish peasant living in Galilee would only get one thing back from their taxes, and that's not being killed for not paying his taxes. The reason that he had to pay so much in tax was that, first of all, he had to support the lifestyle of the guy who ruled Galilee. That was Herod Antipas, one of the sons of Herod the Great. But Herod Antipas, in turn, had to pass an enormous cut of his tax revenue onto the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire in this period was effectively running a kind of a protection racket, particularly in the Eastern Mediterranean. So what they were doing was they were basically saying, well, you can rule, to people like Herod, you can rule your areas, you administer it for us, you keep the peace there, otherwise we'll come and intervene. In return, though, what we'll do is we will protect you from, say, the Parthian Empire, which was to the east. So if they invade, we'll come and help you. But also what you get to do is you get to give us a large chunk of your revenue. This is a pretty sweet deal for the Roman Empire because it meant they didn't have to actually administer large areas of the Eastern Mediterranean. These client kings or puppet kings like Herod Antipas did it for them. So all the images that you see in Bible movies of Jesus preaching in Galilee and Roman soldiers standing around in every street corner didn't happen. The Romans didn't garrison Galilee at all until after the Jewish revolt of 66.
But they were there in case they were needed.
Yeah,
this wasn't like an extortion thing. It was just like, it wasn't like an extortion thing. It was just they were. It was like an extortion thing, a protective ring. Okay, but they weren't there with continual presence, though, correct?
No, they didn't need to be, and it was in their interest not to be, because the Roman army was actually, in this period, was actually relatively small. It was only about a couple of 100,000 men. But they were just placed. One, they were very good, but two, they were placed in highly strategic places. So in the province of Syria, which Galilee was officially part of, the Roman troops were up in Antioch, several days' march to the north, where they were protecting the Eastern Roman Empire from those Persians and the Parthian Empire. There would have been a small body of Roman troops in Caesarea, because the Romans did administer Judea, which was south of Galilee, directly. So they did have their own prefect there. That's who Pontius Pilate was. He was a prefect. He was a subordinate of the governor of Syria, and he couldn't command legionary troops because he wasn't high enough ranking. He only commanded auxiliary troops. So the only Roman troops that were around in Jesus' time were not actually Romans at all. They were actually auxiliaries, and they would have been mainly Samaritans and Greek-speaking Syrians. So that Passion of the Christ movie that Mel Gibson made a few years ago, we had Romans speaking Latin. The Romans who were involved in any crucifixion of Jesus would have spoken Greek or Syriac, not Latin, and they weren't Romans. They were from local area. They were second rank troops. That's beside the point. So, so basically, what you've got in your with your Jewish peasant is he's not happy, because he's living in a fairly tough environment where he's oppressed politically. But he's also not happy because he's a devout Jew. So he believes, if he's a devout Jew, he believes that he is one of the chosen people of God, and he's living in the promised land. But the problem is, if he's a chosen member of the chosen people of God and he's living in the promised land, why is he being oppressed by Romans? And why have the Jews been oppressed by pretty much fucking everyone for hundreds of years? The Jews have been conquered, by this stage, have been conquered by the Assyrians, and then the Babylonians, and then the Persians, and then the Greeks, the Macedonian Greeks, and then they were dominated by the sub-kingdoms of Alexander the Great, so the Ptolemies, and then the Seleucids, and then there was a brief period of independence under the Hasmoneans, and then the Romans. So basically, our first century Jew is sitting there thinking, why is this happening to me? Why is life so bad?
Is there something to be said for the fact that Jews of all people would have a vested interest in determining whether Christ was a myth, right? I mean, they don't even go around with mythicism, right? I mean, is there something to be said that of all people that would probably have a reason to denounce the Christianity because they rejected Christ as the Messiah, right? They think that he wasn't the Messiah that they were waiting for, and so it would make sense to me, at least superficially, and please dive into that. Correct me if I'm wrong. It seems superficially, if he was just a myth, that the Jews would be around a long time ago going, this person never existed. This is a complete fabrication. But we don't see that, do we?
No, we don't. And that's what I was referring to before when I was saying that one of the places we might expect to find references to either to this proto-Christian mythicist form of Christianity that mythicism requires, or to the idea that Jesus just didn't exist, is in the Jewish criticisms of Christianity, of which we do have some references. Now, the Jewish criticisms of Christianity are that Jesus wasn't the Messiah, that he was a fraud, that he was a magician, that he was a liar, that he was a charlatan, but none of them say he didn't exist. Now, of course, the counter-argument to that is, well, counter-argument to that is, well, they didn't start countering Christianity until it became big enough for them to bother. And by that stage, everyone had forgotten that Jesus hadn't existed. So, maybe. But it's another kind of gap in the evidence that kind of makes you think that this whole idea that he never existed would be has a bit of a problem at its core. But just thinking about our first century Jewish peasant in Galilee, what was going on in this period was people were asking that question: why is life so hard? Why am I oppressed when I'm meant to be part of the chosen people of God, living in God's promised land? Why is God allowing this to happen? And there were a number of answers to that question that developed. Now, one of the traditional answers had always been, and we find this in the Old Testament, the various prophets popping up and saying, God is oppressing you by allowing you to be conquered by the Assyrians, the Persians, the Babylonians, and whatever, because you've turned away from God. So what you need to do is you need to live the Jewish religion more purely, and God will respond by smiting the oppressors. So we find that all the time through the Old Testament. That argument was starting to wear a bit thin, though, by the first century AD, because it didn't seem as though that was making a whole lot of difference. Some people were responding to it by going out into the desert and living very, very holy individual lives. So Josephus, for example, was the student of a guy called Bannus, and Bannus was a hermit who lived out in the desert, lived off the land, and spent most of his time dousing himself in cold water to fend off lust. There seem to be a few of those guys, but that was a fairly radical thing and a bit difficult for our peasant to do. There were other people who went and formed communities out in the desert that were supposedly sort of perfect communities. So the Dead Sea Scrolls, at least some of them, seem to have been written by sects such as the Essenes, who went out to the desert and formed kind of a perfect Jewish kingdom out on their own. And that seemed to be another response. But one of the responses was that what was going on was God had withdrawn his power from the world, but one day was going to come back and was going to reassert his authority. And this was because Judaism, in the period between the last book of the Old Testament, the last book to be written, which is probably the book of Daniel, and what we call the New Testament, so this period that's called the intertestamental period, Judaism underwent some radical change. So the Judaism that we see reflected in the Old Testament became quite different by the time we get to our Jewish peasant in the early first century AD. And some of the things that had changed was that their whole conception of the universe had changed. It had been heavily influenced by Persian religion, particularly Zoroastrianism, and also by Greek philosophy. So the Persian influence meant that they now believed that there was a war going on in the cosmos. There was a war going on between the forces of good, led by God and his angels, and the forces of evil, led by Satan and the demons. Now, if you ever had a look at the Old Testament, if anyone's actually bothered to slog their way through it, Satan doesn't appear very often. When he does appear, he appears largely as a kind of a servant of God who goes around testing people, like in the book of Job. But by the time we get to our first century peasant, Satan has become the bad guy in this cosmic war. And this is all coming from the Zoroastrian religion. They believed that there was a good god, Ahura Mazda, and a bad god, Ahriman, and there was a cosmic war going on between the two. This influenced Judaism. So Judaism came to believe, or many Jews came to believe, that there was a cosmic war going on. And what was happening was that God had withdrawn his power from the world, mostly, and Satan and his demons were pretty much in control. They were the lords of the world. This is why the bad guys were winning. And this was their answer to the question of, why do bad things keep happening to me? The other influence they had was from ancient Greek philosophy. Particularly Platonic philosophy believed that the material world was a kind of a dim reflection of a cosmic ideal. And so they believed that the material world was reflecting what was going on out in the cosmos. And so because there was a battle between Satan and God, demons and angels, that was being reflected on earth. And what was going to happen was God was going to intervene. God was going to come back and reimpose his rule on the earth. This got caught up with another idea that one day a descendant of King David was going to come up, was going to arise, and was going to sweep away all the bad guys. So the kings of ancient Israel were anointed with oil as their sign of their favored status by God. So they were often referred to as Messiah, meaning anointed ones, from which we get the word Messiah. So there was this increasing idea that the Messiah was coming. A Messiah was coming, and when would the Messiah come? When God reasserts his rule, his kingship in the world. So there was this idea for our first century peasant that things are going to get better. When God reasserts himself, when the Messiah arises, God will come down from heaven with armies of angels. He will sweep away all the bad guys. He will punish all the bad people. He will cleanse the earth. The Messiah will then judge not just the living, but also the dead, because everyone who has died already will be raised from the dead in a general resurrection, and God will judge everyone. And from that point on, the righteous will live in the kingdom of God, and the unrighteous will be cast out into the fires of hell. Now, is any of this sounding slightly familiar? Yeah. So we find all this.
Quite a bit.
We're starting to find all this in the Gospels. So if you think about our first century peasant, if he is having a hard time making ends meet, if he's really struggling to feed his family, and if he's not happy about the fact that he has to pay these massive taxes to King Herod Agrippa, who he doesn't even regard as a proper Jew. The Herods were Jews, but they were Idumeans, so they were fairly recent converts and weren't considered proper Jews by people like our peasant. If you weren't happy about this, and then someone turned up in your village saying, I've got good news. The kingship of God, the reassertion of God's power on earth, is coming not one day, but coming soon. The kingdom of God is so close you can almost touch it. Repent and believe, and you'll be amongst the saved when the kingdom comes, because it's coming soon. If you heard that and you were our first century peasant, you'd probably listen to that guy. You'd probably listen to him saying that everything was going to get better, not just one day, soon. And if we then turn to the earliest of the material in the New Testament, we find someone saying exactly that. So just to look at a couple of bits from the Gospels, what we find in the Gospels is the very first thing that Jesus is reported as saying, doesn't mean he definitely said this, the very first thing that he is reported as saying in the earliest Gospel, so Mark 1:15, these are the first words depicted as coming out of Jesus' mouth. The time is fulfilled and the kingship of God has drawn near. Repent and believe in this good news. This is exactly the kind of message that we're finding in all of this intertestamental stuff about a coming apocalypse. The time is fulfilled. He's saying it's coming now. The apocalypse is coming now. God is descending very soon with his armies of angels, his rivers of fire. He's going to sweep all the bad guys away. Everything's going to get better, guys. This is good news. The Greek word for good news is evangelion. The English translation of evangelion is gospel. So when it's all the bits in the Gospels about believing in the gospel, what's the gospel? The gospel is evangelion. The gospel is this good news. The apocalypse is coming. It's coming soon. And if you repent, you'll be on the right side of the battle that's coming between God and his angels and Satan and his demons. This is what
that's the very
that's talking about.
That's been the narrative for the last 2,000 years.
Yeah, it is. But the interesting thing is that when we look at the early Gospels, this is very much all of Jesus' teaching. This is they don't everything else that he says is actually focused on this. Once you understand that context, suddenly the Gospels cease to be about gentle Jesus, meek and mild, patting lambs and telling everyone to be nice to each other. It becomes actually about a Jewish apocalyptic preacher preaching that the end of the world was coming probably in his lifetime, if not in his lifetime, then very soon afterwards, because he tells us he's depicted as telling the people he was listening to him. He says in Mark 13, he basically gives a little apocalyptic speech. When you see the abomination that causes desolation standing where it doesn't belong, let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. The sun will be darkened, the moon will not give light, the stars will fall from the sky, and at that time people will see the Son of Man, the Messiah, coming in the clouds with great power and glory, and he will send his angels, gather his elect from the four winds, from the ends of the earth to the ends of the heavens. So here he is talking about the apocalypse coming. But the interesting bit about it is he says, when you see the abomination that causes desolation, when there's a little note saying, let the reader understand. This is in the Gospel of Mark. Mark seems to have been written just after the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem in the First Jewish War in 70 AD. The abomination that causes desolation is a reference to the book of Daniel. But when he says, let the reader understand, He's saying when you see pagans sacrificing to idols in the temple, then the apocalypse will be coming very soon afterwards. And we know
Those are
that
the
when the
warning
Romans,
signs.
yeah, and we know that when the Romans destroyed Jerusalem, just before they started tearing down the temple, the first thing they did as a big fuck you to the Jews is they set up their standards, which they worshipped as gods, and sacrificed in front of them. So this is the writer of the Gospel of Mark putting these words in the mouth of Jesus. But effectively what he's saying is, we've seen this shit. It happened not long ago. So what Jesus was saying is, it's this apocalypse is coming in our lifetimes. It's coming very, very soon.
And I think that's kind of a good place to leave it, though. We got to start wrapping it up here, Tim. So we're going to do some super chats, but do you want to finish that thought? I got to interview sometime because we're really getting close on time. Do you want to wrap up that thought, or do you just want to go into the super chats?
Well, I think the key thing is that that this is the stuff that you find in the earliest Gospels. What you find in the later Gospels is this stuff gets played down, and eventually it gets removed completely. So by the time you get to the Gospel of John, this stuff all disappears. All the apocalypse stuff disappears. The message becomes about Jesus as Savior. So what this means is it is most likely that the reason you get this apocalyptic stuff in the beginnings, in the earliest stuff, and it gets played down later on, is that this is the kind of thing, whether it was exactly these words, that the historical Jesus was actually saying. And it gets remembered, but then as the predictions about the apocalypse coming don't come true, it gets changed.
That makes
sense.
Which
is what apocalyptic sects always do.
You know what? I think there's a lot of verticality in that. That makes a lot of sense to me. Matter of fact, that early on it would have been more apocalyptic, and then as the things didn't come true, they became more of a savior type thing, and the more extreme things. Yeah, that makes more sense.
Yeah.
Let me say something real quick, Steve.
Yes, Steve. Yes.
I just want to say to address. I have been trying to keep up with the live chat and you at the same time, Tim, but it was proving rather difficult. I must say, by some I'm quite shocked and a little disappointed. I knew this was going to be contentious. However, I thought we would be able to handle it as a collective a lot differently. And we've had Richard Carrier on here twice, and the way that we did those was we let him state his case. Steve and I don't know very much about this topic. It would be pointless for us to try to get involved. So what we decided to do, we would let them present their case. Dr. Carrier presenting his, and then we brought Tim on to present his. Where I find the frustrating part is that this kind of outcry of I don't even know what the words you'd call it, but it wasn't seen on that end, and I think because to some extent it plays into that narrative. And we've tried to be completely neutral on both shows. I invite you to please go back and watch the video with Richard Carrier and see if we acted any differently. We did not. I think this is a really sad display from some that I'd expected better from. So that's all I'm going to say about that. And Steve, you can now go into your super chats.
Okay. And yeah, I know very little about this topic. I'm the first person to admit I don't read the Bible very much. I don't study it. I don't have the expertise by any stretch of the imagination to dive into any of these topics with any type of confidence whatsoever. That's why I want to listen to the people that have, and I want to evaluate their arguments. I find nothing wrong with that. That's, I think, what an open-minded person does. I don't have the expertise to contest them or to even accept them. I just am listening and asking questions like any rational human being would. But with that, Pragmatic Culture, $10. We do have contemporary references in the form of Pseudonus. I can't pronounce even the words. Pseudonus, is that how you pronounce it? Pseudonus? Okay. And the Roman tax documents. Dating is a bit off from typical timeline, but only by about a decade or two. Not a huge deal to the whole story. So I think you mentioned a little bit earlier.
I'm not quite sure. I'm not quite sure who I'm not sure who the person that they're saying we have references to. Oh, Cyrenius, right? Quirinus.
Sure.
Is that what it is, Steve? Okay.
Suetonus. Suetonius.
Oh, Suetonius. Suetonius.
Suetonius.
Right,
There's
okay.
Suetonius. I guess.
I'm not sure what they think Suetonius is a contemporary attestation for. We've got some Roman tax documents from Egypt, and we've got them in Egypt because Egypt has a very dry climate, and Roman tax documents in that area were written on papyrus. And so it's just a fluke that we actually have some Roman tax documents from that area. But all that shows is how little we have from everywhere else. Why you'd get any mention of Jesus in the tax document in Egypt, I have absolutely no idea. All that shows is what I was saying is true. No,
would it show he paid taxes?
Well, that just shows that just shows that we've got fuck all. No, almost certainly not. You had to be a landowner. You had to be a landowner to pay taxes.
Okay. Oh, okay. Yeah. Okay. Makes sense. That makes a lot more sense. Yeah, that's true. Gallus Engineer, $5. There's no such Suetonius documents. Suetonius doesn't prove Jesus existed. Well, I don't think anything proves one way or another whether he existed. I mean, we're not really, nothing of these things confirm. We're looking at the overall picture, right? Pragmatic culture, $2. Probability, yeah, and I have no problem with that. That's why I don't think Carrier's approach is necessarily bad. I just don't find it convincing by any stretch of imagination.
Yeah,
I think it's not a great argument for the non-existence of Christ, if you want my honest opinion. But pragmatic culture, $2, and neither does Carrier, I think. Ad Gallus Cranium or GC, is that Gallus Cranium? I don't know. He absolutely does see lives of the 12 Caesars. I'm not sure. I don't know what that means. He absolutely does see lives of the 12 Caesars. Must be a reference to something.
Suetonius is the writer of the lives of the 12 Caesars. I'm not quite sure the context, so I don't quite know what's being argued.
Like I said, I know nothing about this stuff. I am fully inept in this field. I have no compunctions to admit that outright. I think that we need to admit when we have no knowledge of this different topics. I don't ever read any of this stuff. Nothing I dive into at all. I just don't have an interest.
I must admit that disagreement is not bashing. Disagreement does not equal bashing.
Not at all.
Yeah.
No, I can definitely disagree with people. I happen to like Richard Carrier. I actually really like the guy. Doesn't mean I'm convinced by his arguments.
I like them both. That's why I'm able to sit. That's why I'm able to sit here and listen to both of them put their points up. Like, I don't understand where the
I have no idea.
Venom comes from.
It's weird to me too. Pragmatic culture, $2. This quote firmament stuff seems like Gnostic BS. Goddess Engineer, $5. Paul heavily emphasizes that he did not get his information from any man, only scripture and revelation. That's a good point. What do we think?
Just on that one, I mean, Paul makes several comments along those lines. Paul says, I didn't get my teaching from any man. I got my teaching from Jesus, and he's talking about his visions of Jesus because he says that he had visions of Jesus. What you have to do, though, is you have to look at that comment in context. So he's making that point in several places, particularly in Galatians 1, where he's trying to argue against people who are saying, don't listen to that Paul guy. He got his teachings from us, the original followers of Jesus, and their followers. And so he's subordinate to us. And so in that context, what Paul is saying is, no, I didn't get my teaching from any of those guys. I got my teaching purely from Jesus. Then he says, of course, I did go to Jerusalem after I converted, and I did meet with Peter, and I did meet with Jesus' brother James, or James, the brother of the Lord. And so he kind of undercuts the argument that he's making. So to take his argument at face value and considering he's using a bit of rhetoric and say he says he didn't get his teaching from anyone, he's saying that in context because he's trying to counter an argument. When you look at it in the context, it's pretty clear that he did get at least some of his teaching from other people, because he refers to them. He says the people who were apostles before me, and he admits he actually met with them. And it's pretty clear that he's over protesting when he's saying that he got it purely from his visions of Jesus. Sorry, I don't find that very convincing.
0132132666. What is the positive evidence that Jesus existed? Well,
we didn't quite get to that. Unfortunately, we didn't quite get to that.
We know. Yeah. This is how frustrated I got, by the way.
You broke your glasses?
I broke my glasses.
Broke your glasses, man. Jeez.
Yep.
That's not.
Well, I just touched on one piece, and the thing is, there's nothing that's a slam dunk. But what we have is some references that really only kind of make sense if the guy did exist.
In light of him.
Yeah, that's right. So, for example, Paul saying, I didn't meet with any of those guys in Galatians. I didn't meet with any of those guys. Oh, I did meet with Cephas, though. Cephas is the Aramaic form of the name Peter. And I did meet with James, the brother of the Lord. Now, we know from other sources, both Christian and non-Christian, that Jesus had a brother called James. Here's Paul saying, yeah, I went to Jerusalem, I met with Peter, that's Cephas, that's Jesus' friend, and the brother of the Lord, James. Now, mythicists have to tie themselves in enormous knots to try and come up with a way in which brother of the Lord doesn't mean the brother of the Lord. And I've written a whole quite complicated argument where I go through the problems with the way in which they do that. Most people, pretty much everyone, apart from the 5 or 6 mythicists amongst the scholarship, read brother of the Lord as James, the brother of Jesus. It's hard to have a brother who Paul can meet if he didn't fucking exist.
If he didn't exist.
So,
right. No, I agree with that.
yeah.
And do you think, I have 2 quick questions, then the last super chat, and then we got to end this. But do you think that because the topic is so ingrained in humanity about the divinity of Jesus that it's very hard for people to be dispassionate and separate how we would treat his existence as opposed to any other historical figure? And I think that's
exactly
one of the
right.
issues, is that, yeah, I think that's a very, and I understand that it is emotional for some people, and I think it's very difficult to be dispassionate. But I see people saying things that it's disconcerting to me when I see people here say things like, well, Tim came on and for the last 2 hours never gave any evidence of why Richard Carrier is wrong. I have to fully disagree. He presented an argument of why Richard's wrong. You can be convinced by it or you can't, but I don't think you're being intellectually honest by saying Tim did not present counter arguments. He most certainly did explain why he believed Richard's not wrong. He spent 2 hours doing it. I listened to his words. I was paying attention. I'm doing 4 different things, but I still was listening, and he was clearly explaining right Richard. He felt Richard was wrong. Now, you can agree with him, you can disagree with him, you can say he's full of shit and try to explain why you disagree with him, but to say that he didn't sit here and make arguments why Richard was wrong is just fucking ridiculous. I'm at a loss.
It was
for
just
words, honestly.
it was whipped up in the beginning, and just
oh
people,
my goodness. All right, that's my little rant. Sorry, but Pragmatic Culture, $2. Last thing, free for all after show. Let the peasants be heard. I don't have the wherewithal, dude. If anybody else
go for
wants
it.
to, God bless them.
I just had 3 shows right here.
Yeah,
there was
this is enough.
I was trying to pay attention to Tim, and then there was like 6 different shows happening in the live chat and the side conversations. But at the end of the day,
all I could say is, sorry, mate, go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
I was just going to say what I said at the beginning, which is, of course, I'm not going to be able to counter mythicism in 2 hours. Of course, I'm not. I couldn't even get. I got about 3/4 of the way through the material I wanted to present, which just shows how complex this stuff is. But what I tried to do is sort of take some examples of what are some of the key problems with mythicism, and the absolute critical one is the fact that it depends on a supposition for which there is not any evidence that there was this proto-Christianity that believed in a non-historical Jesus. There's no evidence for that. And the bits that they try and use to bolster that idea have to be propped up with, excuse the French, but fucking bullshit like the cosmic sperm bank idea. I mean, seriously. You have to be working pretty hard to believe this idea to accept an argument like that. It's crap.
It's a little bizarre. Let me throw this out so Kyle can end this. Let me just leave it on this, because both groups are asking about evidence. You know, they're saying Richard needs evidence, you need evidence, blah, blah, evidence. You know what? Put in the comments what evidence you expect to see, because I don't know what the fuck all people are talking about, what they expect for evidence. You gave your opinion and you gave reasoning about why you think he's wrong. Right? I don't know what evidence they're expecting you to give besides what you related that anybody can go look up to see the veracity of. That's fucking evidence. I don't know what they're asking for. I'm sorry.
Stop being so sensitive.
I don't get it.
Stop being so sensitive. We all like Richard Carrier. We get that. As atheists, we like Richard Carrier. I get that. I like Richard Carrier. Steve likes Richard Carrier.
However,
I also like Tim. And
I really liked him.
My feelings towards each of these gentlemen matters 0 to what we were here to talk about. And that's the thing that I think we're getting lost on. We're trying to pick teams behind the people and not what the people are saying. And that is the biggest issue that I have seen tonight. Bashing does not mean that it's not the same thing as questioning somebody's stances or arguments. It doesn't work. It doesn't work that way. And at the end of the day, I'll end with and Tim, I'll let you have the last word. But how I started out. What does it matter? Why are you getting so emotionally invested? Why are you having a conundrum and losing your shit over whether a man 2,000 years ago shit and whether he died or he didn't die? It doesn't.
Oh,
we lost him.
I think I lost Kyle XE.
Kyle the EXE crashed.
God's smiting him. Well, let finish I'll finish the question for him, and it's a good question. Is why did it matter? Now, granted, I think I know your answer because you're a historian and I think you want to be historically correct, and I think that's admirable. So if you're going to answer them along those lines, I'm going to support you. But why is this important, one way or another?
Sure. First of all, I need to correct you. I'm not a historian. I'm an amateur, and there are too many people on the internet claiming expertise that they don't have. I've got a
you got a
history, but not a postgraduate. Yeah, I've got a history.
But you like history. Yeah, okay.
Yeah. But why do I care? I care because I am actually very interested in history, and I'm also, as I said earlier, I'm interested in bad historical arguments, and I don't think this is the worst, but I don't think it's a very good one. And I think the reason a lot of people are invested in this argument has nothing to do with reason or rationality. All the people who are talking about evidence before, evidence gets thrown around in this discussion the way that theory gets thrown around in creationism discussions. Those people who are asking for evidence, what they seem to be asking for is proof. Well, if you want proof, or most things in ancient history, all I'm going to say is you're out of luck. Well, that's not how it works. What we have is source material, and what we have to do is we have to try and interpret that source material to work out what is most likely to have happened. That's all we can do. That's all Carrier does. Not very well, I'd argue, but that's what he does, and that's all I'm doing. That's all anyone who looks at this question does. So if you want a slam dunk piece of proof, it's not going to happen, guys. And it won't happen in most things to do with ancient history. So it's what is most likely. And I'd finish by saying it is far, far more likely that there was a Jewish apocalyptic preacher who got crucified and his followers dealt with that by saying he's the Messiah, he's risen from the dead, and he's coming back soon. And Christianity came from that. Unfortunately, I didn't get to the point where I could sort of explain how that stuff about the apocalyptic preacher means that it's most likely Jesus existed. Maybe, I don't know, if you can bear it, maybe I can do that again.
It's not an easy subject.
Was I the only one that froze there?
Yep.
Yeah, just you, man. Yeah.
Because David said that the host timed me out, so I wonder if the live chat got to you, and now you are against Steve and I as well.
No, I didn't.
Damn it, Dave.
You out. No, I didn't.
He says that now.
Out.
I can't trust anyone.
I know. Damn it. They're all against you.
Okay, where did we get to? I'm lost.
He explained why this matters to him as somebody who wants to have correct history. And I think that's admirable.
He just shit all over my point. Great.
Pretty much, yeah.
Great.
But again, people want people. I need to know what people want from
Fantastic.
evidence. I think that you did give evidence tonight. I mean, people can go look into see if the evidence is correct or not. I mean, do they want I don't know what they're asking for. They want you to say, hey, look, here's a time machine. Go back. Look, Jesus existed. Hey, here's Jesus. Here's the man. And I don't understand what people mean by evidence half the time. I really, honest to God, don't.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a bit of a mystery. I think a lot of people don't quite understand how ancient history is studied, and it's not about slam dunk proof. That's anything.
That is for sure. And speaking of which, that reminds me. It was asked earlier in the live chat. What will be how they worded it? Don't punish us or something like that. We are lifting the rule about the Sphinx now. So.
We have another episode about it coming up. I didn't have anything to do with it.
I did.
I didn't have anything to do with it.
But let me explain. He's not on my side. He is a geologist. He does he's over there actually. He's over there last year, I think. But anyway, he's a geologist, and he the things that we were talking with Maggie Bryson about, all the weathering and stuff like that, that's what he does. So he's going to come and finish off the talk. He's not on my in my corner though. He's gonna
Not many are.
prove me wrong or whatever.
No, funny.
Anyways, everybody. Anyways, hug, loves, kisses. Everybody's huggy, and thank you, Tim. I'm looking forward to I'm going to be monitoring this particular video more than most for the comments. We're inundated with comments. I do try to read them all, but it is hard. But this particular page, I'm probably going to pin, and I'm just going to check it every so often to see what people are asking and how you're responding. If if you said you're going to, but don't feel like I have to.
Get that fuck you dumb cunt ready.
Yeah, I mean, and I'm fine if you get to that point. Like I said, don't feel obligated like you actually engage, but because I mean, we all get tired of it. But
here's
people spam me with hate mail. Yeah, people spam me with hate mail. They'll get that, but I'm usually pretty patient.
I use that all. Here's who I blame at the end of the day, though. It's not Tim's fault. It's not Steve's fault. It's not my fault. It's not anybody in the chat's fault. It's Jesus' fault. If he would have been either confirmed to be born or not, and left like bones or something, we wouldn't be here.
Yep.
Well, they don't fossilize easily, so no fossils, no evolution, no Jesus. It's all wrong.
How many things did we just combine right there?
I don't know.
Shall we wrap up?
Mom and Dad are going. Mom and Dad are going to bed. Go to your room, everyone.
I think we probably just pissed off at least 75% of the world with that.
I think so.
Good.
Our work here is done.
Good. Hey, good night then.
Good night, fellas.
Non sequitur. Your facts are uncoordinated.